Hello, Julie.
Hello, Jared.
Hello,
Thank
everyone
you so
out
much
in.
for having me.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. How you been?
Um, I've been well. I've moved a great deal since we were in graduate school together, and moved to Rhode Island about 2 days before the pandemic became what it is. So things have been a bit chaotic, but I'm very happy to be where I am now. How
Very
have you
good.
been?
I've been good. The pandemic has sort of hit our world pretty hard, but I'm doing okay. Um, I'm on vacation, which makes it even better.
Yeah,
So
nice.
that's exciting, and
Love.
I'm glad to be here. So I just wanted to, so hello everyone out there watching or listening, because this is also a podcast eventually. Um, I just want to say hi, and I want to introduce my friend. She's actually over there, not over there. Julie Roundtree. Julie and I went to graduate school many moons ago at Mary Baldwin College, now University, in the Shakespeare and Performance program there. Um, we did some stuff. I don't really even remember. We did some stuff. Um,
We did a lot of
I
stuff.
once had to call an ambulance uh, for your benefit. But other than that, we just like went to grad school together, and here we are. And we're here today to talk about Shakespeare and intersectionality. And so I'm going to let Julie introduce herself professionally, and then we'll get right into the conversation. So go
Okay.
forth, my friend.
Thank you, my friend. Well, as Jeremy said, I'm Julie Roundtree. We have very similar backgrounds in terms of graduate school, studied Shakespeare and Britain's literature and performance back in the day. Professionally, I am both a stage actor and also a professor. And in the nearish future, hopefully the fall, honestly, depends on what happens with the pandemic. I will be teaching with Boston University's presentation program. So I'll be going into some local prison systems and helping some folks there who are soon going to be released obtain degrees and work on their job interviews, things of that ilk. So I'm very excited about that opportunity. So that, in a nutshell, is me professionally.
I think the prison work is just flabbergasts me. I'm so impressed. Um, so we're going to talk today about Shakespeare and intersectionality. Most of our audience has some familiarity with Shakespeare, or at least familiarity with the fact that we're familiar with Shakespeare, if that makes sense. Um, and the but intersectionality may be new for some folks, so I wonder if you could introduce the concept for us.
Sure, sure. So intersectionality is a term that was first coined by a law scholar in 1986 named Kimberly Crenshaw. And she discovered that we all, as individuals, have these characteristics or categorizations, which she then titled intersections, that make us up as human beings. And so the main ones, just to give examples, are gender, race, and class. So these are things that we often can't do much about. And that those intersections, especially once they are interconnected, they change the way that we are treated as human beings. And thus, a lot of us are oppressed because of those intersections, or we are privileged because of those intersections. So, just taking myself as an example, I am Caucasian, so that by itself makes me privileged. I am low-ish middle class, but I have folks who can help me if I'm not doing so well. So that also makes me privileged. I'm a woman, that makes me oppressed. But I have those other two first ones that help me in a lot of ways that allow me to be mostly privileged. And then, of course, there are other intersections on top of those three. Level of education. For me, my education level is pretty high. employment level, sexuality, and so on and so forth. I am a heterosexual, cisgendered individual. That makes me privileged. Honestly, a while back, I was preparing some statements of scholarly intent to send out, which I know you're familiar with.
Oh, yes.
Send out to lots of universities for jobs. And it occurred to me that there are two subjects that really matter a lot to me right now. And one is Shakespeare. But two, very much in the world, pardon me, allergy. Very much in the world that we live today is intersectionality, and how folks are treated. I had the privilege of teaching at a couple of HBCUs and getting some really illuminating responses and having some illuminating dialogues with my students. And that was really the first thing that prompted me to care a great deal about intersection. So anyway, rambling aside, I wanted to look into Shakespeare and how he presented people of color, possible characters who were part of the LGBTQ community, QA community, and disabled characters, and if those representations, what those representations tell us in terms of their intersection. And I am most interested going forward with this project in finding out how my students see Shakespeare's characters and their intersectionality that is put forward. Are the characters believably portrayed in terms of their intersectionality, and how much, and I think this in some ways can be rather depressing these days, but how much is the way that they have been treated during that time period, how much of that has changed today based on their intersection, if that makes sense.
Sure. So if I could rephrase, it's like when we talk intersections, I'm a visual guy, so we're talking about places where you're, it's like you're overlapping Venn diagram, right? So you have an identity that's discrete, but then it can overlap with another identity and another identity and another identity, and you could be say for me as a white person, I'm in one circle, but that could overlap with my maleness, with my cisgenderedness, and so depending on what circles you bring, you could sort of land in a very marginalized spot or a very privileged spot, or I would imagine for most people somewhere along the spectrum.
In between, yeah, absolutely.
So, what kind of work have you done on this so far?
Conversations in class. I have had the privilege of being able to teach a number of theater classes to students who are not theater majors. And I also taught a Shakespeare literature class at Bethune-Cookman University. So just initial conversations with my students, because again, as you know, as a white heterosexual cisgendered individual, I'm not going to presume anything about how people of color would feel about these characters, for example. I found that, for example, one young man in my Bethune-Cookman class said that the way Othello is treated based on his intersections was really resonated with him, and the reasons were he's going forward to get his education. He comes from his parents also have college educations, but he is African American, and he walks down the street and people treat him differently than they should. People immediately. He said sometimes people back away from him even though they have no reason to, and I know we're seeing a lot of that today. So the fact that Othello is an individual, a high-ranking individual in the military, but is treated the way that he is for being a person of color and a person with a disability, that really resonated with my student. And he particularly loved doing the last scene and being able to read it out loud in class.
Mm-hmm. Do you think so? Othello is a common example we come to in conversations like this because it's an A title, it's high profile character, and that play deals, of course, squarely on with the intersections having to do with race and gender. I think. Are there other characters that kind of float to the top for you like that?
Yeah, sure. Certainly Shylock, Richard III, because of his disability. But then, you can go forward and look at characters that aren't as obvious as for example, Juliet. Juliet is obviously privileged in that by our understanding of this Italian world, she's white, and she comes from wealthy parents, but she's also young. And I think in this particular case, that is to her detriment. And she is not terribly educated, and that too could be to her detriment. Some other cases that aren't as obvious, like Ophelia, for example, or Lear, we're dealing with mental disability. And then you can consider what the other intersections are that go along with the two of those and how they are affected as a result. There's a quote that I wrote in my packet, my statement of scholarly intent, and it's from a high school teacher. And she put this out to the Washington Post. I enjoy reading a wide range of ethnically diverse writers who tell stories about the human experience as it is experienced today. Shakespeare lived in a pretty small world. It might now be appropriate for us to acknowledge him as a chronicler of life as he saw it 450 years ago and leave it at that. Out of curiosity, what do you think about that quote? If I can turn that around to you for a second.
Thank you. I feel like I've heard it. I've heard that sentiment before, right? Because when we deal with Shakespeare, the problem of dealing with Shakespeare is its potential points of inaccessibility. And I think that deals with the language. So we could be, when you talk about the intersection of education, we're talking about contemporary students who may not have the education required to access that language. They may not have the context required to access the content. But I think what the quote is pointing to is we think studying and dealing with Shakespeare is a dangerous proposition, and we think it's dangerous because inside that Shakespeare universe is a bunch of risky stuff like racism and sexism and treatment of disability and all kinds of really potentially dangerous stuff that when we expose ourselves to it in rehearsal or in the classroom or on stage, it puts us at risk. It puts us at risk because it unveils our inner junk, you know what I mean? Our society's inner junk, but it's also a risk because, and I know you know this to be true, when you say something on stage, people think that's you. Do you know what I mean? And when you say it in the classroom, even though you might sort of have a fairly detached relationship to the material, people think that's you. And so in these places, if you are not especially careful, using Shakespeare can be a colonial act, it can be a sexist act, it can be a racist act, it can be an ableist act. And so I think for me, special care has to be taken with it. And one of the things I think is useful about the quote is saying it may not be helpful to think of Shakespeare as the person with the answers, but as a person who is like sort of a mirror reflecting back his time. Does that make sense? And that allows us to sort of detach from the Shakespeare part of this, like he's a problem or the writing is a problem, and take one step back and say, well, like the society is the problem, the culture is the problem. Look at how much hasn't changed in 400 years, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
I know I mentioned that's one of the things that really draws me to this topic is look how much society hasn't changed in 450 years, and why that's a huge deal. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Curious what you're making me think about that. Problematic that is. I do think that while you have to be careful about I think it's an important conversation to have, and to talk about what that means, Shakespeare's personal thoughts. Of those particular characters, and are they a good representation of our intersections as real live human beings today? And if not why? I'd like to know from my students why you feel that is true. And if you do feel that they are not a good representation, do you think that's because or because those people were just treated differently at that time? What was I about to say? Oh, but I would also that Shakespeare dead white. We've got plenty of dead white guys. Shakespeare knew what intersectionality was necessarily, or that, like you said, that he has all of the answers. I'm also in no way suggesting that we just read dead white guys. I know personally that by as well. So I think we need to read Shakespeare and read that stuff.
Yeah, and so it's great that you bring that up because we're actually in the middle of the week here at Speaking Shakespeare where we're trying to put Shakespeare next to someone else, and specifically that's Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton, and sort of reading that as a modern Shakespeare play for lack of a better sort of phrase or concept. But I think it's really important. I mean, like, I think it's important to do it from a writing perspective, but I also think it's important to do it from a performance perspective. So, like, and I think part of what that means for me and for maybe Sweet Tea, I think, is to try to, like, think deeply about the materials that Shakespeare is made from, and it is made from mostly white material, and entirely male material. From a like, here's what I'm using to make my plays this week. Here are the actors that I have perspective. It's mostly white. It's entirely male, probably, although there may have been some offstage help. It's mostly straight. It's mostly cisgendered. It's mostly ableist or abled. And so one of the questions that I try to ask is, now the materials are different, right? Now we don't have an excuse. Now we can have women. Now we can have a different looking cast. And so, what are the materials that we have? In your context, it might be people who are incarcerated, right? That's a different set of material than the plays were originally built for, and yet, like, part of our work, I think, is to provide, is to see what Shakespeare does when new materials are being used to make it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I do love very much the fact that, and it's slow going, but that in theater communities we are starting to see people understand that we need more access for not just playwrights who are not white guys, but not that there's anything wrong with having a white playwright, but we need everybody to be involved. The company that I am working with right now, the Glass Horse Theater Project up here in Rhode Island, I'm in a production of Caesar, and I'm playing Caesar, which is really exciting. But Brutus and Gargantua are also women, and we're going to be doing a couple of other scenes. For example, I'm in a Richard III scene, and our Richard III is actually. So these are the sorts of opportunities that I'm hoping we can see a lot more of as we move forward in the theater world. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Back then, the world, as the lady in her quote, was small. It was very similar. So they couldn't have women on stage. They had mostly a white group of actors. The queen was white. So that was what was available to them. But right now, we've got much more, and we should be utilizing that.
So tell me more about how, like, specifically with regard to performance, like, how do you take the notions of sort of intersectionality in its research and apply them in the performance context from where you're sitting?
Well, it starts in the classroom. And I am going to, I lead my classes not like a talking head. I'm sure you're very much the same, but as discussion, because that's interesting to me. I don't want to listen to myself talk for an hour and however minutes. I want to hear my students. Hopefully my house is not burning down.
I appreciate you lingering through the emergency. That's great.
At least I'm doing something interesting as I go out. No, I think it's just the lady above me cooking. But no. So first, there's discussion with my students, and then what I would very much like to do is with them on board and being as active as possible, put on a small performance, even a small performance series in which they have an opportunity to both direct and act in scenes, in specific scenes from Shakespeare. And I would like for them to choose one. So this would be in one of my classes where I get to several with my students. And I would like to possibly even do a comparison situation where the students do sort of a typical traditional version of, say, the Richard the Third scene with Lady Anne, and then do a less traditional version where maybe they're both women, or Richard the Third is female and Lady Anne is male. And continue to do a couple of different scenes of that nature, so that you see side-by-side comparisons of what changes when the intersections of these characters are enough, but not in such a way that it is, because I hate it when that.
Well, it's really interesting because I to that point, I mean, part of what's important, I think, particularly given our background at the same graduate program, is that we treat the text and its creators as a sort of partner in that experience too. So it's not like we want to, because there's a way, what I'm saying is sort of risky, I realize that and meaning up front, but there's a way to marginalize the text too, which I don't think does anyone any favors either.
No.
And like treating those people as the human beings that created it, I think is as important as an exercise as you would with care of the people that you're dealing with in the room. Do you know what I mean? And you wouldn't want to write them off, pardon my pun, in any way. And so part of what our background is, I think, is about putting everyone, as you mentioned, on equal footing, right? So you've got writer, text, director, teacher, actors, and ultimately in the performance setting, audience, sort of operating on equal footing. And like, I think when you do that well, you are playing with the material of intersectionality even more, right? Because those actors are able to bring their own identities to the conversation in the classroom, and when it's in front of an audience, they're able to do the same thing. It's a more collaborative, cooperative, co-creative approach, as opposed to something that's like a little bit more hierarchical and directorial, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I also think, just in terms of having taught communication a decent number of times over the years, we all have our own perspective, we all have our own reality to live in, and our intersectionality, our intersections very much play into that. It's we can be very open-minded individuals, but it's impossible to sit in the audience of a play and not feel a certain way about what we are seeing based on our own personal. And I do think that that's absolutely true of actors as well. So you're right, there are and directors and pretty much everyone involved in the theatrical process. There are layers. There are the intersections of characters, what we think that is indicating of the author. They're the intersections of the director, and they're the intersections of audience and folks performing this.
So, let's say you have an unlimited budget, an ideal world, like you're doing what you want to do with this work. What does that look like to you?
Pretty. It would look like as I'm sorry, did you just say something?
No.
Okay. I think there's a slight delay with us right now, so it looked like it was nice. It would look like taking every student that I could possibly bring forward from the classes that I teach onto a stage and having them play roles that teach them in some way in terms of their intersections. And it would look like them being able to direct each other as well. So I'm babbling a little bit. It would look like my students having the opportunity to costume and design and direct a show with intersectionality in mind. I'm babbling. I'm sorry.
It's all good. No, keep going. Keep going.
It would look like a way to present Shakespeare, to present theater that makes the audience think. That makes the audience think not just, oh, okay, this is another tired production of Shakespeare I've seen a million times. Rather, make them think not just about the intersection of the characters in front of them, but what their own intersection means and what that means about personal thoughts, like how they feel about individuals who embody these sorts of forces that we mentioned as well on characters.
And no, that's good. I mean, because what it points us to, right, is like this sort of equitable way of making the thing, right? An intersectional way of making the thing. We're not just talking about intersectionality. We're going to practice it in the classroom, in the rehearsal room, where everybody gets a voice and everybody's style can play a part, as opposed to one person who has the special training, who has the special education, who has the special access, who has the privileged voice. Instead of that, we're going to try to crack that open and make this we're going to model what we're talking about, right? We're going to model this sort of more equitable approach, right? And that's a big shift. And what's more than a big shift, it's a threatening shift, right? Because it undermines the hierarchy like nobody's business. Because there are people like me who went to school so I could be at the top of a hierarchy. Do you know what I mean? And so this is like subverting that in a really powerful and interesting way, right? Where if you're intentional about it, it's moving people who aren't as prepared into a privileged position, moving people who are coming from a different cultural background into a privileged position, and it's putting the group in that privileged position, you know? So I think it's just fantastic. My question is, when have you seen when does it get you into trouble? Does that make sense? In the classroom, in the rehearsal room, when do you run into trouble with it?
Well, I think the biggest trouble, the biggest thing that I would run into is if I try to control everything. So, that's one of the reasons why I want to put it in the hands of my students, who by and large over the years have been people of color, and I've had a lot of I would, but when does it get me in trouble? I think when maybe students start to question some of Shakespeare's intentions, when they really start digging deep the play. Okay, as you mentioned earlier, was this guy sexist? I want to perform something that's sexist. Was he racist, or was he talking about the time period? I don't want to be part of something that has to do with racism. I think academically, when you really go deep into the place, that's when it would get me in trouble with the student. In terms of getting me in trouble with my colleagues or higher ups, I don't know.
That's good. If you don't know, that's good. That means they're doing their job and keeping the
I hopped around from school to school over the years just because I've had to move so much, that I hope what it would do would be rather fuel a discussion, and maybe make some other faculty members think about how important it is to let students run things and you be more of a moderator. Because if I'm doing a production of Othello and I want really the focus to be on gender and on race and on disability, and I have students who fit into those intersections, those categories better than I do, I want their opinions. I want them to be directing. I want them to be acting. I want to sit in the corner and give them my opinions and give them my guidance. And that doesn't always happen in any class. That's something that I aspire to do.
Sure, I think part of what you're pointing to is it creates a good trouble, right? It unsettles the things that need to be unsettled, right? And that's not everyone in the universe is secure enough to be able to deal with that. I think theater people, despite their sort of profound insecurities that drove them to the field in the first place, have, and I agree with you, you said earlier, we've got a lot of work to do still, and I agree that that's absolutely the case. But in some theater rooms, and I think in many theater rooms first, before they're in corporate boardrooms and other settings, in businesses and in law firms and wherever else, I think in theater, we do have a little bit of practice at that empathy thing, and we do have a little bit of practice at sort of making space for some of those voices, which is not to say we're great. I don't mean that at all. But I do think that sort of in our work, we sort of stretch those muscles just a bit more or a bit differently than those other places. And hopefully some of our work is about sort of unsettling and shifting that sort of human habits, you know what I mean, that drive us into the dark and bad places to begin with. And I think we're doing that work of unsettling things. We're doing okay.
Yeah, focusing on the human condition. No, I do think that you're absolutely right in terms of what we do in theater being a little different, a little bit more emotionally driven, because I know that in terms of the jobs that I've had over the years, theater is where I end up becoming closest to people the quickest. And I don't think it's any secret that that's because of the fact that we have to work humanity. And focusing on topics like intersectionality at this point, theater in the arts is much better than on, and I like Oklahoma, but just putting on a production of Oklahoma that.
Yeah, I agree I appreciate that word safe, because I think that's like part of our job is to make a safe space where danger can happen.
Yes.
And that's what I think careful work in the issues here of intersectionality can be really, really powerful, because as we see, like as we look out at the universe at this particular moment in time, I mean, the danger is there, and the threat is there. I think for everybody, about many things, about everything from healthcare to race to sex and issues. But everyone is feeling a threat of some sort. Everyone's feeling a threat, and they don't know that that's okay. It's okay to feel threatened. You and I and our theater friends know that it's okay to feel threatened, as long as you're sort of processing those responses. Do you know what I mean? And so that's why I think this kind of work it gives us practice for the danger, a safe space to practice danger, so that when we get into the dangerous places in the real world, that we have something to speak into it. Do you know? And we have some wisdom from having gone through that many times before, hopefully. Yeah. So looking ahead over the next year or two, you mentioned your new position. What kind of work do you think you're going to be getting into as part of it?
Well, so the class that I am, the course that I am scheduled to teach is one that I actually got to develop myself, which is really exciting. And this is, of course, for Boston University, that I'll be teaching at Framingham Correctional Facility for a group of women. If I do go forward in the fall, if they let us into the systems in the fall, there are a lot of safety precautions that are being, of course, thrown down. So I'll only have 10 students at max, when before it would have been more than that. So that's kind of disappointing, but obviously safety first. So I'm teaching a communications class over there now, but what I would love in the future is to bring work like this over to correctional facility and talk to the folks over there about intersectionality, what that means in Shakespeare, in literature, and what that means for them as individuals, and then get them to cast shows and direct them and keep having these conversations along the way and perform for whoever we're allowed to perform for. I know that's on the surface, in terms of plans, but that's what I would really like to see happen. And if not, with the individuals in the correctional facilities, if not for them, definitely with other students that I have. I am still going to be teaching through Savannah State, even though I am all the way up in Rhode Island. I will be teaching online. So who knows? Maybe something virtual can happen, which would be different for me. And I'm terrible with technology, so I might might have to go through a little training to make it happen. But I think a fantastic use of something like Zoom is having students come in and direct each other.
Yeah, I'm still figuring out the how to do theater on Zoom. I have not. I don't know. I'm just maybe I'm just an old man now. But if you discover anything, you let me know. Yeah, I mean, what I hear you saying is just I just want to underline it for the people listening, because it's I think to do this thing is to reassign how power works, and it might happen in a small scale, like with 10 incarcerated people at a time, or in a small classroom. But like that's where the work happens. That's where it starts. Is like we're not gonna fix the world. We're gonna fix this power dynamic right here. And when we fix that power dynamic right here for these 10 people, it's going to multiply and multiply and multiply into their lives, right? And I think like that's the human exploration that theater invites us into. I think Shakespeare too, even with its problems, and certainly the work you described. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting because even the typical classroom, if you think about it, you've got a professor standing up in front of the class and students in front of them. That's such a power move right there. And I'm not going to lie, being as short as I am and everybody thinking that I'm 20 years old, I like standing up in front of a podium, but also, depending on what's being discussed in my classes, really like to just sit in a circle with my students. That removes that power, that authority position from me a little bit, and I've noticed that students seem to relax more. But yeah, no, I kind of with this, I sort of want to flip intersectionality on its head anyway, and let the people who are more oppressed, are in a place of power, have a little bit of privilege for once, like you said, even in the classroom.
Yeah, and it's I mean, it's one of the reasons I got into education, and I think one of the reasons I got into theater, although I learned it at a relatively late date. I mean, I think I got into theater because I didn't like my own voice. I liked other people's more, and I'm going to say something very dangerous, but like you get to kiss other people on stage.
Yeah.
And it's kind of fun. I'm not going to lie. That's why I got into it when I was like 17 years old. So don't blame me. I've moved on. Everyone who's listening, I've moved on to other things. I'm just saying, as a 17-year-old, you're not grown yet. That's all I'm saying. Sorry.
That's very true.
I have to like put an asterisk by everything, But yeah, it's good to see you.
It's wonderful to see you too. We've grown up a little bit, haven't we?
Like a tiny little bit. I have more gray hair for sure.
Well, I do because it's covered up in dye right now.
Listen, you might have inspired me. I may show up next week with a bright blue beard or something.
Oh, please do. Please do.
Well, thank you. Let's do this again, shall we?
Yeah, I would love that.
All right, I'd love to learn more about what... yeah, I'd love to learn more. Once you get started in prison, I'd love to learn more about how that work's going.
Thank you. I'd be delighted to do that.
Sounds good. Well, have a good day. Hopefully the building does not burn down around you.
Well, the alarm is no longer going off.
That could be a good thing or a bad thing. the alarm not going off could be a good thing or a bad thing.
That's
Hopefully, it's a
true.
good thing.
I think we're stuck now.
All right. Well, be well. Be safe. I'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. Bye.